We've been talking about the same shirt that was the first project for you to sew. This may not look the same, but it is exactly that shirt, and I've just cut off the facing, and actually I've cut off the extension too. So this is the center front line. So we've been thinking about everything you can do with this, and it was mentioned about, well, what would it be like if you made it into a vest or a sleeveless garment? You know, the rule for making sleeveless in flat pattern is that you come in 1/2 inch and go up 1/4 of an inch at the armhole. So in other words, if it's a garment that you put a sleeve in normally, that's not going to work so well for sleeveless because it's just too open and you perhaps would see lingerie and all. So you need to make that a smaller. All right, that's the rule, but that's not exactly the way I would always do it. I've traced that pattern and put it onto this pattern material. And so the black line shows you the original. And I've just come up about, this is about 1.25 inches here, that I would, if this were mine and I wanted this as a sleeveless, I would want to fill in at least that much. So that's a lot more than 1/4 inch like the book would say. So I don't always do things just like, you know, the rules are. And then if I were doing sleeveless, I would definitely come in like my blue lines here, because remember this is a drop shoulder. Remember that is a wider shoulder seam and that the sleeve kind of comes down onto the arm a little bit. The other thing, as long as I was doing that and talking about sleeveless, regardless of whether it's a vest or a sleeveless blouse, I wanted to go ahead and mention that this could be changed into a scoop neck very easily. You know, you can make a tank top out of this. This is pretty high for a tank top, and kind of a wide shoulder, but you could change this so easily. So with this one front, I'm showing you again how many different styles you could have. But everything I've just shown you is not all that I could do. So in flat pattern, there's also a concept that is called contouring. And that means making it smaller in a certain area of the body. So I mark this as the apex, or where the bust would be. Up in this area, a woman gets smaller. So you could bring in the armhole so that it doesn't gape. And therefore I have slashed in and gone to a pivot point at the apex, slashed in here, and when I close this, as you can see the overlap, this opened up because I slashed here and slashed to here, overlapped. Then I needed to fill in so that this would be equal, and that was a good idea also to be bringing that up. But this changed the width at my hemline of my garment, and do I want that? If I don't, then I would simply cut off this exact width over here, and I would be back to the same measurement that I started with. So contouring is always taking in an area that you want to make smaller, and this is a good example of doing that. The other thing you can do is put an armhole dart in. So this is a very small dart that comes out of that armhole, but that obviously will cause the armhole not to be gaping at that location, and that would point down to the apex also. I'll just turn it here, and perhaps you can see that little dart that makes a change there at the armhole. So this is the shirt, again, cut out of this wool crepe. And you can see that I've run 2 rows of long machine stitches here and left the threads hang along. This has been pulled up actually just by the tension on my sewing machine. I honestly have not pulled the threads. But the idea is that you would very often grab these threads, and probably the bobbin threads, and pull them up so that you were making it smaller in the armhole. And that after you've pulled it up, then you could have brought in the armhole to the extent that it wouldn't gape. But in addition to just pulling up ease stitching, I'm going to do some pressing. The idea is that I would press just on the seam allowances where the ease stitching is placed. So I pulled up the ease stitching, And you really never can tell exactly what's just the right amount for a fabric and whether you can shrink out the fabric so that it will not look gathered. You definitely do not want it to look gathered. So let me turn this so that you can see, and my iron I think was in the way. So you can see how I'm just putting the iron into the seam allowance here. And I'm giving a shot of steam so that it will shrink that out and not look gathered. So let's see what that does. So you can see that there's no gathers there. And you'd say, well, is it even enough to make a difference? But it is. It's subtle. But there is more tighter yarns here than over here. So that's the whole idea. But that doesn't necessarily want to stay that way. Again, let me turn it this way so my iron won't be in the way, unless we put stay tape there. So we could use fusible stay tape, like I have here. We could use stitch-in stay tape. So I could just, honestly, I could just hand stitch this or machine stitch it in place there. But I'll go ahead and use this fusible. And I'm going to cut off my threads so that I'm not fusing those in place. Now I don't mind if the gathering stitches are fused in place because they'll be in the seam allowance. The gathering stitching or E-stitching is always in the seam allowance. But I didn't want to fuse those extra tails, thread tails. So I'm placing the stay tape so that it covers the stitching and stays only in the seam allowance. And I'm steaming it so that it goes in this curve. I'm using stay tape that is straight grain. This would honestly be easier if I had bias. And I'm sure I do somewhere, but I just could put my hands more easily on this for this demonstration. And I have curved it with my hands as I was pressing. So I did make straight grain stay tape work. Now, this is going to have a facing on it or a lining or something, but everything will be in the seam allowance and it will help this hug in. Let's take a look at what that looks like flat. So it looks, you see this fullness, but when that is sewed, it will not show that. Here's just a little piece that I have done, pulled it in and then pressed it. I pressed it under the seam allowance. I even did it on the neckline here because I have put E-stitching there and stay tape, and if this were a V-neck, that would be working beautifully.